let me start by saying thank you all for coming today. This is a tough day. Everyone is distracted. We've had too much to worry about, but we're all essential workers, and I'm glad you're here. And the people are staffing the grocery stores and the hospitals, and we've put off our intellectual life many months too long. I'm glad you're here to partake in this. I don't want to say too much. You've all seen the bulletin that gives a little bio about Ramesh, and so I will not bog down things with further introductions, other than to say, for those of you who just joined us, Ramesh was interviewed by NPR today. He's going to give us the link so we can follow up with that, and has expressed a willingness and interest to try and tie in the ideas he had planned to share with us with recent events. We'll benefit from that. I want to thank Amr El Abadi for initiating the contact with Ramesh, and Lisa Parks for helping to organize it as well. I'm going to back out because I have more fun being a student than a teacher. Thank you, Ramesh. Please begin.
Thank you so much for your kind invitation, Amr, for your kind invitation, also Joe and Cynthia. And it's always a pleasure to be in dialogue and to see my dear friend and someone I admire deeply, Lisa Parks. So, and thank you to the rest of you who are able to join us today. I'm going to try to speak for about 20 minutes here just to outline some of the main ideas around this kind of so-called digital Bill of Rights kind of concept that I've been trying to push everywhere and anywhere possible. I am trying to work multiple journalists on this right now, including people who I don't have complete agreement with politically, like Thomas Friedman. And I'm also trying to work people in Congress around this as well. As a full professor in the UC system with all the privileges that provides us, I believe it's my responsibility, for someone like me at least, to try to advocate for causes and values that are built upon my empirical work that are far greater than my mere research, which might only disseminate in academic scholarly publications. So I'm very dedicated to supporting the public and progressive interests of our UC system and my university, which is UCLA, the Department of Information Studies. So I'm going to just share some slides and talk you through a bunch of ideas. This is going to be quite broad-based and very journalistic in a sense, and then we can have a conversation about it. And I apologize in advance, I got to leave at 1 because of a student meeting that I have to have. But I hope we can follow up on this, and I will send the NPR link also right, when we're in the discussion part of the conversation. I'll put it in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to share slides now. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Maybe I'll make this, big screen here. I hope that works. Did it work? Yeah.
Yes.
Everyone can see that okay? Fantastic.
Yes.
So a lot of these ideas are being touched on in my last book, which was just really designed to be written for a very mainstream public. It was written journalistically, and it had depth in its specific chapters, but it's quite broad. And generally speaking, the charge of this book, Beyond the Valley, which I spun out of that book, I spun lots of op-eds and kind of a platform to try to do greater advocacy, is a charge that I think all of us are interested in, which is a zero-sum. We're in a zero-sum moment when it comes to digital technology, by and large. Of course, depending on where you look. I'm talking about on the larger scale level of kind of global economic and political power around the governance of big technology companies. And I believe, and the charge of this book is to try to pave the way toward a digital world, which, as we know, digital technology is embedded in almost everything imaginable, pave the way toward such a world where the interests of the 99% are supported and lifted up in their multiplicities and in their diversities. So there's a lot of work in this book, and I'll allude to this, about the working class, about economic justice, also about communities on the margins, both in our country and around the world, indigenous communities, Black and brown communities, women, LGBTQ communities, trans rights. These kinds of issues are also in the book. And the book really is sort of trying to pave the way toward what do technologies look like that, yes, can be good for business interests, but not in a way that, costs everyone else in such punitive and deep manners. Okay, so this is not a news story for any of you. As we sit through COVID-19 and we potentially face future pandemics and the ongoing and ever more looming climate crisis and set of crises, we have become more technologically dependent than ever before. And it's notable to look at how the sort of transfer of power to technology magnates has been endorsed not just by sort of the larger scale society, but democratic governors like Andrew Cuomo, for example, in New York, who's basically rolled out the red carpet to folks like Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, Bill Gates, we all know who Bill Gates is, and so on. You guys are just in charge of our future. But we're also noting that during this pandemic, and this is May 21st, so the numbers are way higher actually, I should have dug up a more recent version of this, that a few billionaires, almost all completely associated with technology, have made staggering amounts of money. I mean, $80+ billion apparently at this point, about approximately $80+ billion for Bezos alone. So what that means is that as we rely upon technology, the instruments by which technologies are being monetized, which by the way, almost none of us really completely know or understand, or the valuation of technologies, and I'll talk about that in a moment, are heading into the hands of the very, very few. We're no longer talking 1%, 99%, we're talking 0.01% probably of the population. And we see that as people are struggling in this country in a way that we haven't seen before in decades. This is obvious to many of you as we fight like hell to try to get a $2,000 one-time stimulus check into people's hands. So we'll kind of just start with that, because technology to me when we talk about technology, we're talking about the modes by which almost every aspect of human sociality and economy and political life are mediated, right? So those pipes are being controlled by the very few. And that is extremely important. The pipes are not just the infrastructures, but also the platforms themselves. Okay, so to yesterday, there's a significant amount of evidence that I wouldn't say organizing, but discussions and conversations around the violent domestic terror white supremacist takeover of the Capitol yesterday was being kind of galvanized on the platform Parler. And we've also actually heard quite a bit about other platforms like QAnon, 4chan, some aspects of subreddits, and so on. I think it's very important to note that these platforms have symbolically stood in for many folks in the sort of populist right, if you will, who feel alienated by big technology companies and platforms. President Trump himself has over 85 million followers on Twitter, and for the most part during his presidency until fairly recently has basically praised social media as his mouthpiece to the people, all the while using that as an attempt to discredit any journalistic or evidence-based media, right? So-called fake news and so on. There's some evidence that over half of President Trump's followers, or approximately half of President Trump's followers, and that's a larger phenomenon on Twitter itself, are bots. And there are certain heuristic methods of deciphering bots, right? And I can get into that. What we do know is if something was kind of emerging on a platform like Parler, and that's not the only place it emerged, how did it get into to people who are maybe non-Parler users? We're talking about 10 million or so Parler users, maybe less. How did it become such a pervasive phenomenon? And that's because of the media ecologies that are dysfunctional and dystopic that fuse across different platforms, right? So we know that platforms like YouTube, Google News, Facebook, Twitter tend to select for content that is predicted to maximize, as they say, user engagement, which is attention, right? And we know that sensationalist, inflammatory, and hateful content will grab all of our attention no matter how virtuous we are, because it kind of, it brings up a certain type of instinctive response. And we also know that dopamine-associated technologies tend to, dopamine is an optimizing factor for technological design. What releases dopamine? I can go into all of this in some detail. So I think it's extremely important, as we see, Facebook's recent announcement within the last 2 hours to suspend President Trump's account until after the inauguration, to look at how the tech companies, by and large, have always tended to lag behind these issues. There is not a certain sense of progressive, proactive governance that occurs within these technology companies, simply because the very model by which they are accumulating so much valuation, data, and to some extent profit, though that's a bit more complicated, is very much at odds with what we need in terms of democratic governance, transparency, and true accountability around these issues. So right now, we just see yet another spectacular failure where, in this case, not even disinformation, but basically a closed worldview has become people's complete worldview when they go onto a platform that they think of as their gateway to the world, partly because they resist and are critical of what they see as elitist media. And there's certainly some truth to the elitism and self-serving nature of large-scale corporate media, right? So we can see, sort of Noam Chomsky's arguments about manufacturing consent from decades ago, and there are many other kind of more fundamental media scholars who've been making it, Robert McChesney, others, talking about corporate consolidation around media, now rear its ugly head in the response by the populist right via social media. So this is, I think, a very powerful and important transformation that we've seen that really needs to be dealt with. Because every major technology company might call itself a technology company, but what they've taken over is every sort of vertical of human experience, right? So a company like Uber is the largest taxi company in the history of the world, owns almost no vehicles at all, hires almost nobody in any sort of secure sense. Look at what happened with Assembly Bill 22. Doesn't provide insurance, doesn't provide a living wage, doesn't provide benefits. And the idea really is to cut all costs as much as possible while monetizing and hoarding data, as well as creating a capture target market. And we see that with, I have Alibaba's image here in this slide, but we can also see this with Amazon, obviously, very spectacularly. So if you notice, if you do an Uber, where the money goes, it will say Uber Technologies. No? And I think part of that is the sort of myth, and this can get into some interesting kind of philosophy of technology discussion, that technologies by and large, I think we're popping this bubble a little bit, are somehow politically or socially or morally neutral. It's just technology after all. It just is making sense of the world around us and personalizing content for us. We're just users of this technology. But as Shoshana Zuboff and others have argued in her book on surveillance capitalism, she has a lot of nice one-liners that you're welcome to use that I'm sort of stealing for the moment, which is like, are we Googling or being Googled? Are we users or being used? Are we socializing on these platforms or are we being socialized? And I don't think it's an either or situation, obviously, but I think we have interesting questions to ask because we are completely entering into an opaque environment, not only when we go onto a single platform, but pretty much all the time, because pretty much all of these platforms, or many platforms, are constantly gathering data about us, even if we're not actively using them, and even if we've never created an account with these platforms themselves. And there's a lot of evidence on that I discuss in the book. Okay, so here's a very interesting phenomenon that I've been thinking about a little bit more lately. I've been looking at the SEC reports for Uber in particular. Many technology companies, and Uber is probably most notable, are losing spectacular amounts of money. They're not profitable, yet they're valuated at hundreds of billions of dollars. And that is very interesting. So I had a chance to speak to the former, well, he's a member of the Greek parliament, but the former Greek minister of economics, Yanis Varoufakis, who works very closely with, or was working pretty closely with Bernie Sanders, whose campaign I was an advisor, or like a surrogate for. And he makes the points that what we're now seeing, especially in the tech space, is what he calls the zombification of capital. No longer is it about profitability being somehow necessarily always positively correlated to wealth. It's actually about valuation. And valuation and profitability now no longer have necessarily a very strong positive correlation. That's a point he was making, not my point. But I think that's very interesting to think about in the case of Uber. Like, why is Uber losing so much money? And they actually say that very directly to their shareholders in their SEC reporting, yet worth so much. And that's a question I'd like for us to think about. Obviously, it's the capture of data, but it's also the potentiality. If I have this target market, if I've wiped out all the competition, at least in the taxi industry, which they have done in many ways, and I have all this data amassed, what can that be spun into? And in that sense, we have to think about new forms of digital capitalism as a certain type of process, not a certain state, right? It's kind of what are your new modes of extraction that you can head toward? And I think that's very interesting to think about in this space, in this discussion. Very quickly, I'm going to go into this because there's not a lot of time. But every major technology company pretty much these days has some sort of AI division or calls itself an AI company. I actually am a former artificial intelligence developer, totally dated. And especially back from when I was at the MIT Media Lab, I was building certain kinds of machine learning systems. And what we're finding across the board, I'm certainly not the main scholar in this space, that these technologies are turning out to have racist outcomes. But not just that, sexist, gendered, and classist, and so on. Why is that? Of course, because more or less speaking, machine learning technologies are conditioned on a couple factors. The coders, not because they're racist, but they might have various forms of implicit bias, and if they don't reflect the larger population, they're not going to have that understanding, that humanistic understanding in how they design technologies. Most engineers tend to be white and Asian males, at least in our country. In China, obviously, we're talking pretty much dominantly Asian males, some women as well. And they're learning from data sets that are revealing of our world and its own inequalities and injustices. And we know that racial bias, if not outright racism, is a massive phenomenon in our country and around the world. So that's why we see these things occur, like this simple little example where former President Obama's picture with FaceApp to make his image more beautiful, so to speak, was turned whiter and younger. And I think that those are important points to kind of consider. I would say far more perniciously than something silly like FaceApp are the ways in which these technologies and these kind of machine learning systems are being embedded into infrastructures. IoT systems, smart city systems, and other kinds of, in this case, institutions or infrastructures, right? So the criminal justice system or lack thereof, or the policing system or lack thereof, are all using machine learning algorithms that are basically adjudicating someone and even making predictions like Minority Report style on the possibility of someone committing a future crime simply based on, even not asking for their race, but based on questions and answers that are positively correlated with racial identity. So this is award-winning work that I felt should have won a Pulitzer Prize by ProPublica. I highly recommend reading this full article. I assign it in all my classes, which shows how the gentleman on the left who had no felony conviction whatsoever compared to the gentleman on the right who had multiple convictions. The gentleman on the left, African-American gentleman, was deemed to be a far higher risk of committing a future violent crime, which informs a judge's sentencing decisions than the gentleman on the right. I gave you a million other examples. My book is full of them. And I have a lot of colleagues doing really important work in this area, as do all of you. This is not just an issue when it comes to these kinds of, explicit kind of race-based systems, or even systems like facial recognition systems that I think a lot of you know about, that are, treating folks like Serena Williams, Michelle Obama, Oprah, all seeing them as male rather than female, but also machine learning systems that are being used in the supplanting or replacement of various forms of work, like human resources work. So this is a really nice article by The Guardian that reports on work done by a bunch of computer scientists, including Arvind Narayanan and others. Kate Starbird's done good work on these areas at Washington. Arvind Narayan's based at Princeton. And this looks at how a certain kind of text mining technology called word embedding is actually being used for automated systems that are replacing or supplanting human resources work, that are scanning CVs and are looking for words to make decisions around which CVs will make the cut. And they are selecting again and again and again for science and engineering jobs, men over women, simply based on how they're able to determine or ascertain qualification based on gendered sort of categories around qualification for a particular job. So this article spells that out really well. And of course, a very spectacular example of what's gone wrong is how our data can be brokered in this country, which is not true in the European Union with the GDPR and so on, which I don't think goes far enough, but is much better than what we have here. I can buy all of your data. That's what Cambridge Analytica did. I can aggregate and cross-reference that data with other data I might harvest, and I can retain that data, which means I could have Lisa's data from when she's 18, and I could use that against her now, you know, or any of you. Sorry, Lisa. So these are features. Cambridge Analytica is a feature of the problem. They're not, but even though the media likes to consider them a spectacular anomaly. But our technology ecosystem, our big data ecosystem is set up for these kinds of things to occur. So I think that what we need to do is radically re-envision and reimagine and also push regulatory possibilities around this. On an economic issue, I'll do this really quick. We see drivers having incredibly pernicious impacts on them by the Uberification of that part of the industry, the gig economy and so on. I tell the story of Doug Pfister in the book, who is a driver, one of quite a few, who committed suicide, who had a livery license, medallion license, was driving livery in New York City, costs a lot of money, by the way, and was having to work way more hours than ever before for less pay than what he used to receive because of Uber and Lyft basically being given carte blanche. So some of my friends at the Independent Drivers Guild have been able to push back on some of this with the New York State Assembly, but it's a tough slog. And what we see more than ever are that people of working in middle classes are working more hours than ever before for less than ever before if you adjust for inflation. In fact, the youngest generation is the first generation in the history of this country to make less than its parents if you adjust for inflation, and life expectancy in this country is dropping. So the country's working great for some, but that's very few. And a lot of issues, we see the ravages of this kind of system. Of course, folks like Andrew Yang kind of built his brand around the universal basic income idea. That is not a new idea. Martin Luther King called for that. Thomas Paine called for that. Dolly Parton has given dividends, who's a great humanitarian, has given dividends to people affected by climate disasters. But at the same time, it's an interesting idea to consider to put in the toolkit as we look at this, certainly during this COVID pandemic, we should be thinking about ideas like this. There's a lot of good discussion about the problems with UBI. Varoufakis argues that there should be more like a universal dividend. There should be public ownership he's quite left as an economist, but that there should be greater public equity, that the entire public should have some equity over every major corporation in this country. That's his argument. Some people have made the argument, like my colleague Doug Rushkoff has made the argument that UBI is a booby prize because it legitimates the system as it stands. So there's some interesting conversation we can have around that theme, but it's one of many conceptual kinds of tools or proposals that I think we should have robust debate about, and in what context, with whom and not with whom, etc. But what we do know is there's a massive redistribution and transference of wealth that has occurred for decades that is now being amplified gone gonzo these days. I've thought a lot about, or not a lot, some about portable benefits. The idea that hey, if I work 10 hours for TaskRabbit, 10 hours for DoorDash, 20 hours for Uber, that they should all pool together to support my benefits, especially in a country that doesn't guarantee healthcare as a human right. So that's another model that's being discussed, portable benefits models, and I can discuss that later as well. Another model, of course, we have to think about is with respect to automation. I had some interesting kind of changes of heart on this because I gave in a little bit to the hype of this article by The Economist, which kind of convinced me for a while. But then I talked to, I'm sure some of you know, the brilliant Cory Doctorow, who kind of convinced me that actually there are tons of jobs that can be, that will remain secure. And actually that there are many jobs, and that's the point of this article, which I already believed in a way, there are many jobs that can be created where humans work alongside automated systems with more dignified labor, with perhaps greater economic resources coming their way, and so on. And so this article I'm not a big fan of mines myself, but it makes the argument that as miners are replaced by robotic automated systems, the miners should still keep their jobs, not to mine, but to train and work with and audit and interact with those systems. And of course, we see many industries that are not likely to actually be threatened by automation, despite, the point of this article in The Economist, which is a good article in a lot of ways. For example, like with truck driving, we're talking primarily about long haul truck driving that would be automated, not necessarily all these Amazon trucks that we see all around us. At least I see them like all the time on my block here in Los Angeles. So the point being that we really should think about issues around that. I have been, of course, trying to, I'm not a politician, but I believe very much that there should be a federal jobs guarantee, and that can then force the private sector to actually pay people and hire people the way they should be. Okay. And then, of course, a very interesting idea that's been pushed forward by Trevor Scholes and Nathan Schneider, who was early involved with Occupy, is the idea of greater equity. As I alluded to before with the universal dividend idea, what does Uber look like if the drivers had equity in the business, if not owned it, right? Why can't these sorts of ideas that are brilliant about technology, where we can crowdsource and distribute and kind of micro work together, why can't that accumulate value and resources that support all of us? That to me is a very important possibility. And there are initiatives like that. Fairmondo, the Green Taxi Collective, they're very small scale, but it's important. For me, it's important to look at these issues and also consider these issues in relation to, what Lisa and I have worked on a little bit together on a global level, the idea of infrastructures, right? Who governs infrastructures? Who monetizes them? Who designs them? How salient are they to the values and knowledge practices and belief systems of the communities that are using them? How much are the infrastructures created by and for people versus them being subjects of those systems, right? And, obviously a very quite well-known example or experiment in the idea of a bottom-up technology infrastructure exists with the Detroit Community Technology Project, the Red Hook Technology Initiative. Those are a couple in the United States. And what we see again and again and again is that communities that are underserved by these systems of power because they don't fit the economic and political logic of those, even things like internet service providers, far from being silent or invisible or somehow like perpetually subjugated, are showing agency and collective action and mobilization in their own ways by engaging, stepping into third spaces, by creating and shaping their own destinies that partly involve technology. And that's what we saw happen in Detroit. Note, the growth of urban farming in Detroit. That's another example. To me, this is not about technology, it's about power and voice and values. So, in that spirit, I've been doing field work for like a long time, though I haven't been able to go for the last year, in the Oaxaca region in southern Mexico, where communities, Zapotec, Mixtec, and Mije communities, 63 of them have been building their own autonomous cell phone networks. Like each of them has their own network. That's very important. It's built upon these cultural and political value systems they call comunalidad and tequio. These basically mean that your work, your practice, your life is, sure, it's your own, but it's highly integrated. It's highly connected to the larger whole. And this initiative, which I had oh my God, it was so amazing to visit them. Ictacop, which is in Celtal, which is a Mayan language, means words in the wind, is a bunch of like early 20-something teachers who are kids. A lot of them are kids of Zapatistas. They don't really see themselves as Zapatistas themselves, in a place called Abasolo, which is about an hour and 45 minutes outside of San Cristobal de las Casas, which is in Chiapas, in southern Mexico. These guys wanted a community radio station, and a lot of this movement comes out of community radio. They wanted an intranet so they could like share stuff locally, and they wanted a backhaul link to the internet. They couldn't afford any of these things. So what did they do? They thought they could buy a backhaul link to the satellite, and that didn't work. So what they did instead is buy one landline connection 20 kilometers away and figure out, because they have the local knowledge of how to kind of transmit a signal, they bought one like wired connection and figured out ways to rig that signal to allow it to travel over 20 kilometers in a, I wouldn't say mountainous, but hillish region. So that to me is an example of local knowledge, right? Spatial, geographic, intimate, ecological, environmental, economic, I probably already said that, political, cultural, cosmological, and how there is, we really need to pay attention to those initiatives and incentivize those initiatives in every way possible. We, in this case, being, I think, regulators and those in power, because the power of technology to support community, cultural kind and issues expression is undeniable. The question really is you know, who runs this game in a lot of ways, and that, you know, kind of relates to something that I was very proud to help write or contribute to. When I was working on the Sanders campaign, we wrote a policy that I really hope the Biden administration will take up. I'm, you know, hopeful that that will happen, which is really incentivizing internet access by supporting municipalities, communities, collectives, and small businesses. And because, you know, many of you know this, but our caliber of internet coverage for the price we pay in this country is so much worse than countries like South Korea and Western European countries. And so that's because of a certain type of economic logic that undergirds, in this case, internet service providers, specifically like the Verizons and AT&Ts and so on of the world. So I think the last major kind of component that I think is important in a digital Bill of Rights, I kind of talked about themes rather than, I mean, I'm not a legislator here, but I'm sort of framing what I think of as key components are issues like right to repair and the environmental justice issues associated with technology. So this is something I know Lisa does a lot of work on, or our colleague Toby Miller does a lot of great work on. You know, as you all know, when this thing is designed to die, right? Just like a Monsanto seed. I mean, that's a loaded way of putting it, but it has a 4-year lifespan, I think, more or less. When it dies, we get rid of it, and often these things go to electronic waste places. Look what's happening here in Kibera in Nairobi, where I wrote some part of my book. People are taking, they call it jua kali, or hot sun. They're taking things that are designed to die and providing it with new forms of life. Steve Jackson, our colleague in communications at Cornell, writes beautifully about these issues. And so I even make the point in the book that even 3D printers are being created out of 65% electronic waste parts in Kenya that are outperforming American and Chinese 3D printers, because it's designed by people in places with an understanding of the infrastructural, material, environmental, economic constraints. So constraints drive innovation. And that's a whole other model of thinking about innovation, right? We say that idea that necessity is the mother of invention. How about necessity is the mother of innovation? So that's something to think about as well. And a lot of these folks call themselves jua kali, which means hot sun in Swahili, because they often start with like a bench on, you know, just on the side of the road and a soldering gun. And the AB3D people, Africa-born 3D, the 3D printer guys that I was talking about, they were like, hey, we used to be jua kali, now we have a roof, because they're able to now create a business and hire about 20 plus people. And I think these models of innovation are very, very important to consider. So I bring a lot of these ideas together as best as I could in a piece that I wrote for The Guardian, but I try to use that term digital Bill of Rights anytime I'm getting an opportunity to push stuff with the media. So let's have a conversation about this. I tried to do that as quickly as I could. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh. This was really very good and thought-provocative, especially given the times we're going through. Yesterday, today really have made one think a lot about the interaction between civil rights and technology, and the interaction between them. I come to this from a computer scientist point of view. So let me just start by, you mentioned two or three things that really resonated with me and what a computer scientist can start to explore, because I'm like, you're not a legislator, I'm not a social scientist or a legislator, but like this idea of portable benefits that you mentioned. this is a very powerful idea, especially in a gig economy where we have individuals who are working for different companies that are actually competing with each other, do not want to share anything. And yet it is important for us, it's imperative on us as a as a system, as a country, to support the ability for these people to work. And so, for example, I'm working on a project where we could allow privacy preserving operations so that you can actually interact between, you can go from one company to the other working in different shifts and impose constraints without revealing your private information to any of these individuals, and yet still aggregate that I am working enough hours so that I get the health benefits, etc. Another notion you kind of mentioned related to this, relating to scalability and partitioning of information, is this employee co-ownership. Here we have individuals who together can actually accumulate or provide a service, for example, a social network, whatever it is, a Twitter-like, a Facebook-like, without necessarily exposing more of their information than they want. You bring up the issue of AI, and this is where I'm going to pose the question, because this has been, so us as technology people, we eventually work for these companies and there are challenges. And the current example that has come up a lot is Timnit Gebru. As an AI person, she was working at Google. She was actually developing models that would have benefited potentially Google, the entire company. And yet we have a tension that we are not able to resolve, or they were not able to resolve. And this is, and a lot of your examples about discrimination and all this stuff really hits it on the head in her case. Do you have something to say, any kind of thoughts for technology people, how we should get involved in this world? We need to get involved, and there are definitely technological challenges we need to do. And I can sit here in my ivory tower and do my research, but our students, not all of them can do that. They will need to work in these companies. So just any thoughts?
I'm just so grateful that there are engineers and scholars like yourselves, to be completely honest. Like, and there are, and I have them in my university as well, who care about these same issues and are invested in not only supporting the education of our students, but also pushing these ideas out in terms of technological models. I think it's very, so obviously this is something that any of the big tech companies could do in a second, but I think showing as a proof of concept that people can have a social media experience while having full transparency about what's being collected about them and why they see what they see is an incredibly important design and engineering exercise that can be done right away. I think, you know, but in many cases, my interventions are less about technology and more about governance and design. But design in that sense is very much an engineering connected. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think the story of Timnit is I was following that, and you know, I don't understand what happened there, because I've read her work over the years. I think her work is really important. I'm not really sure what happened there. I was in Uganda writing about an AI lab based out of Makerere University, which is a small chapter in the last book, and kind of doing the stuff in Kenya that I mentioned. And, you know, that was when the announcement was made that Google was going to open a large AI lab in Accra, in Ghana.
Oh.
And, you know, so it's like, why, if your goal is to resolve these issues, I would guess ostensibly through kind of these sorts of models, which, you know, is certainly in Google's bottom line and interest in, you know, kind of connecting, you know, those in sub-Saharan Africa primarily to their technologies and you know, milking that. Why would you do things like this where you have brilliant female, I believe she might be of Ethiopian descent, or Eritrean, yeah, or Eritrean, I messed that up, you know, why would you do that? I don't completely understand it. You know, I know that they're in the kind of so-called diversity and inclusion space. There's a lot of buzz in the not just big tech companies, but in Fortune 500 companies to kind of deal with that issue. But it's not clear how much that's actually going to transform what they roll out. I think the idea of, you know, obviously computer scientists have paved the way when it comes to privacy protection, encryption type technologies. I think it's worth noting that Tim Berners-Lee is all steamed, and Jimmy Wales, about what's going on, and has kind of tried to build a back end. I think it's called Solid, his platform, which is kind of a blockchain based platform where you can do all the things we do on the internet, but not
preserving.
without the data going all over the place. You know, the issue though is the network effects issues and the kind of early adopters issues. You know, it's like I would love to jump onto another platform, but in the Parler case, it's interesting with this kind of, which is Boom, because it fits Trump's populist rhetoric that big tech is out to get him, which is a total lie. At least in terms of the evidence, in terms of what we've seen, it fits some scholars like Robert Epstein, who's a cognitive scientist who's been on Tucker Carlson all the time, saying that Google likely cost, I don't know if you guys know about this, likely cost Trump millions of votes in 2016 and even possibly more votes in 2020, right? So rhetorically, people shift to Parler, but it works still for this Trump new populist agenda because of the media ecologies, because the stuff moves between the platforms, right? We saw that with the Vegas shooter conspiracy theory, or with all the COVID conspiracy theories. In the Vegas shooter case, the idea was that she's a Hillary Clinton supporter and a Rachel Maddow show viewer. That started on 4chan. That was trending on Google News, on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter within 12 hours. So I don't know how well I answered that question.
Thank you.
I'm excited about you all.
Thank you. I think I'll give it to Lisa and then we'll open it for questions.
Thanks, Ramesh, for the work you've been doing, and thanks to Amr and Joe for organizing the event today. It's really great to be back in a CITS discussion where we have, you know, people across the divisions and fields and disciplines. It's always exciting to participate in CITS events because of that. I thought I would just ask kind of a few questions, almost as rhetorical questions that maybe Ramesh, you might want to comment on. And then I just kind of wanted to highlight 4 areas of work, maybe more from a humanities perspective, that might be germane and relevant to the question of, you know, formulating a digital Bill of Rights or addressing some of the macro level questions. I mean, I guess the first question I have is, do we really need a digital Bill of Rights? Or do we need to actually regulate big tech companies or break them up, as some of the antitrust movements have been, and the lawsuits against the companies have been suggesting? A second question I have is, wouldn't a digital Bill of Rights also have to be written in ways that would account for non-human agencies, given that, as Joe and I think Amr mentioned at the beginning, that bots now populate and maneuver on, and in some cases control and, you know, directly shape activities and behavior on the web. And I'm thinking of recent books like Philip Howard's book, Lie Machines, and another book called The Hype Machine by Sinan Aral, which both deal with the question of social media, fake news, and bot agencies, non-human agencies. So how would we deal with the non-human in a digital Bill of Rights? And then a third area of questions I would raise have to do with the fact that people have long been oppressed and actually kind of disenfranchised under the current Bill of Rights. So is a new technologically defined Bill of Rights really the answer? Or do we need to also imagine and put into practice other kinds of interventions? What is it really going to take to interrupt the current kinds of digital capitalism we see not only in the US, but in other parts of the world? And to redirect resource flows. Like, what do we really need to do? Is it really just about creating shared ownership structures, as you suggest in the Guardian piece and in some of the comments today, Ramesh? Or do we need to really think, you know, from more foundational premises about what we need to do to allow people to have a feeling of rights in the current climate? Another challenge in developing a digital Bill of Rights, at least in the United States, would be that many congressional leaders do not actually have adequate technological literacy in formulating policy and in making decisions about our digital technological environment. And a lot of their staff members, some of them have this background, but many of them don't. And they rely on advocacy organizations who regularly publish technology reports that are read and used by you know, the congressional leaders in trying to think about how to deal with big tech and their power. So I think, like, in order to move the conversation forward, there are areas of research we can look to. And I would just break them down briefly into 4 quick areas, and I'll try to go through this quickly. But one of the areas we need to look to further is policy experts and digital rights advocates who sometimes work quite closely with policy scholars. I'm thinking about the work of, I've just read part of a book In Progress by Jennifer Holt, who's on our campus, fortunately. And her new book, Cloud Policy, is really distinct in that, unlike other scholars who often are just focusing on the current moment, on the internet and web-based platforms and apps, Holt understands the long and complex history of US media and telecom regulation in the United States, and goes back to early telephony, the definition of the electromagnetic spectrum, debates around data centers in the 1960s, and looks at the fact that recent telecom and internet policies, sorry, I have something in my throat, and acts of deregulation are part of long-term patterns that emerge from analog regimes. We really need to know what she calls the longue durée of cloud policy, and not think about this kind of magical entity of the cloud that suddenly pops up, but to history. And I really can't wait till CITS invites her to give a book talk, because this book is really going to be groundbreaking. And, you know, she also has been tracking, you know, what happens to public interest when private entities are allowed to reign supreme in the ways they have. And as she succinctly describes the current moment, this is a quote from her book: "Our data is now for sale without our knowledge or permission. Our browsing habits are being monitored and exploited by tech companies to help formulate more profitable algorithms. And the US government is surveying its own citizens, collecting millions of phone records and emails every day with the aid of big tech." She has been working closely with the advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. called Democracy and Technology, in order to try to figure out how to deal with the question of digital rights. And she and I just did a research project where we interviewed staff members of these organizations: Public Knowledge, EFF, ACLU, Access Now, Ranking Digital Rights, many of which are based in Washington, D.C., to try to understand the work that those advocates are doing to try to ensure that our rights aren't further eroded. So I think that area of policy experts and digital rights advocates is a crucial area to build from. Other areas, briefly, I'll just say 3 of them really quickly. Scholars who are studying digital technology and social power and justice. And we need to recognize that free speech and privacy rights are never guaranteed. They're aspirational. And it's important for us scholars in CITS and those interested in IT or a digital Bill of Rights to really engage closely with the work by Black feminist scholars who've been really doing incredible research in the IT area, addressing questions of power differentials. And I'm thinking of books like Simone Brown's book, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, Ruha Benjamin's book, Race and Technology, and Joy Buolamwini's work on the Algorithmic Justice League. Two of these scholars, Sophia and Ruha, just gave a talk on campus as part of a panel organized by Black Studies last quarter by Sharon Tediga and Terrence Wooten. Another area, so that's like an area about digital technology and social power, especially with a focus on race. Another area I think is really important is international analysts. There's a need to really be tracking the international operations of big tech companies, to understand how companies like Facebook have in some cases superseded national telecom providers, become the in effect infrastructures in these countries. And in Brazil, WhatsApp is basically the main national telecom provider now. In effect, it operates that way. So to be thinking about how these companies are operating internationally and to formulate something like a digital Bill of Rights with awareness about how these companies are maneuvering in different parts of the world. And then the last area that I would just briefly mention is just the need to constantly be thinking about human technology relations in the age of algorithms and AI, which also came up. And given the irreversible decisions that have been made to deregulate these media and big tech companies, we now live with the circumstances of these decisions worldwide. And so we need to keep critical understandings of human machines of relations, of agency and power, and the various forms that agency and power can take. There's a lot of important research coming out of work on algorithmic cultures, on automation and AI, and in the humanities and social sciences. And it's important that we continue to theorize how power and agency are changing in the midst of all the conditions we're enduring. And, you know, books ranging from Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction to the new book that's just come out, Cloud Ethics by Louise Amour, or The Costs of Connecting by Coldry and Maijas. On our campus, Rita Reilly has long been working in this area. So I think we need to continue to consult this fourth area as well. And I'll just leave my comments there. And sorry if I went on a little long. I just wanted to kind of bring some of the more humanities inflected areas of research into the conversation that Ramesh and Amar started. So.
Thank you. We have 6 more minutes with Ramesh among us. We have lots of time after, unfortunately, Ramesh has to go. If you have a comment or question on which you'd like to get Ramesh's response, this would be a good time to jump in.
I have a question.
If I could just speak up for a moment, I have to run another meeting at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to have to sign off. So I didn't get to my stuff. I wanted to talk about the frame of Bill of Rights as opposed to the frame of regulation, which are different kinds of politics and have different kinds of logic. And I think that'd be really interesting. So I'm sorry we couldn't get to that, but I wanted to thank you for your talk and say I hope we can interact again and get into some of those things. So I'm going to sign off, but thanks again. And nice to see all the rest of you as well, too.
I have a question. It's about the first kind of part of your talk, talking about the way that fake news cascades, across social networking sites through these network effects. And I'm actually holding the book that you, Lisa, talked about, the hype machine one here. And here's just like a little picture, right, of the study that they found on the network effects that was published in Science in 2018, right? And so they showed that the original seed tweets or, you know, posts, what have you, of fake news tended to come from humans because they're the ones who wanted, like, you know, control over the fine-tuned nature of, you know, whatever misinformation they were trying to spread. But that, like, the kind of starburst pattern that happens afterwards are all from bots, right? And then from there, it gets a little bit more complicated. And they even talk about this idea of cyborgs, right? Like, you know, social actor bots that are overseen by humans. And so I just thought that that's, you know, such a fascinating idea, that it's really not necessarily an either or, and that there's maybe more nuance to, you know, the interaction between humans and bots as it relates to, like, fake news. And I hope I'm not getting too, you know, down in the weeds, because I know it's not really the focus of your talk, but do you have any kind of any interesting work you could point me to or anything to say about that?
Could you just phrase that kind of as a like a one-liner question, just so I can make sure I understood that? Thank you.
Where do you think the future of the ways that bots interact with humans is going in the context of the way that fake news spreads through, like, cascades on social media?
Yeah, I think it's good that so I'll just say this super quick, because I think two themes we saw overlap with Lisa's great comments with the 2 points that were made by Bruce and yourself. One about the rhetoric of digital Bill of Rights versus regulatory action. It's a rhetorical strategy I'm taking at the moment, mainly because this is also what a couple people I'm connected to in Congress are also taking, and also because we're trying to appropriate American vernacular. And also the idea is to try to think not simply about regulatory action as sufficient, but more thinking more expansively about empowering and emancipation. So language Bill of Rights is obviously completely rooted in all sorts of vernaculars that are both positive and troubling. But given the reality that Lisa points out, that has not come to be, absolutely agree with that. But I think the question, you know, the conceptual and rhetorical and linguistic frame of this is, right now, that's what's working for me. But you know, more than anything, I think, just to your points, Lisa, I am super excited and open to, obviously, a lot of the race study scholars are people I know and whose work I've read. You know, thinking about some of these other texts and work that's out there, especially on cloud policy, that's a brilliant point. And, you know, more than anything, what I'd like to do is be a conduit, so I can bring all of these folks and their writings into something that can actually be pushed forward on a regulatory or Bill of Rights kind of level. A core component of that, per your question, is your name, Justice. To your question, Justice, is really about the agency, and Lisa made this point also, of non-human actors and bots and so on within this digital ecosystem. I think that is extremely important. You know, I think that we really need to understand the emergent behaviors of these kinds of actors, kind of almost on a Latourian kind of level, like and Deleuzian almost kind of level. And also I think we really need to understand what they mean in relation to the last point Lisa made, which was about human technology kind of interactions and sociality. So I don't have real conclusions on those issues, other than to point out that these kinds of phenomenon, like we're seeing with the amplification of disinformation, you know, the distortions of reality, are a function of an ecosystem that we think of as a social network, a social graph, wherein in fact components of that social graph are being drawn by forces that are non-human and that we have no visibility or control around. So it is absolutely essential. And you know, you can think about things like facial recognition systems also as non-human actors within assemblages of surveillance and policing, you know? So that is a huge point that a few of you now made, or at least two of you made today. And Amar, I think you also kind of alluded to that I think I really want to bring into the fold. So I've been taking notes while you all have been saying this stuff, because this is actually, you know, Lisa, you remember this. I actually reached out to you and like 20 or 30 other people to kind of get input on this. And as far as the digital literacy skills of our congressional electors, absolutely, that's a huge issue. But what I'd like for them to do is to appoint some sort of commission where I can bring, you know, the Ummers and Lisa Parkses of the world and Joes of the world to join me in these issues. And I also, one argument I'm making is that we need a bipartisan journalistic body to do some vetting of news sources. And those vetting systems should be influencing the algorithms around visibility and virality. And that's kind of, again, a fairly pragmatic proposal that I think we could actually implement.
I need to be responsible to let Ramesh go because of the time. The rest of you are welcome to hang around and talk some more. But let me just close by saying thank you, Ramesh, and what a wonderful sandwich today, from Amr talking about the design and engineering aspect, Lisa talking about many things, but primarily policy, and Ramesh sits in the middle between the disciplines and orientations by invoking the engineering and the policy and the journalistic outreach that he does with research and then expresses in a way to reach the public. This spans the horizon. It's deliciously interdisciplinary. What a great opportunity and a great discussion we had today. I'd like to talk more about that, but the bell has rung on 1 o'clock. And so for those of you who do have to go elsewhere, we thank you for coming, and those of you who can stay.
And I just want to say thank you to all of you. I learned a lot just in this last hour, and it was rapid fire, but I really appreciate it. And I look forward to the time when we can all hang out in person. I'm sure all of us do.
Thank you.